What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. Directed once again by George Miller, who wrote this film alongside Nick Latharos. This film stars people like Anya Taylor-Joy, Chris Hemsworth, Tom Burke, Alyla Browne, Nathan Jones, and many more. So here we are, nearly a decade later after the release, which is completely crazy to me, of Mad Max Fury Road, a film that instantly became one of the most celebrated in the franchise, directed by George Miller, who of course originated the franchise. And now we have Anya Taylor-Joy taking over the character of Furiosa, played by Charlize Theron in that film, to give us a prequel film here, with the villain being played by Chris Hemsworth, a villain known as Dementus. And I think the marketing has done a pretty good job of showcasing this film simply as a prequel to Furiosa, the character, and not really leaning too much into what this film is all about. So similarly, I'm not going to give you guys too much context on what this film is actually about, other than the fact that this is a prequel to the events of Mad Max Fury Road, about the character of Furiosa, most notably showing us how she got from the green place, the place she's trying to get to in Fury Road, to being involved with the world of Immortan Joe, as you see her at the very beginning of Mad Max Fury Road. Of course, as I mentioned, the main villain of this film is the character Dementus, played by Chris Hemsworth, another warlord who is out there trying to control the wasteland, who unfortunately Furiosa finds herself in the mix with. Other than that, you don't really need to know much more going into it, so I won't spoil anything else for you guys. But going into this, I was excited to see what this was going to be all about, as George Miller is a fantastic director, and as I said, nearly a decade ago gave us one of the greatest installments and my personal favorite installment in the franchise, Fury Road, that utilized incredible practical effects, makeup, action, over-the-top stunt work, and was just bombastic, fun to watch, had compelling characters, an interesting story mixed with non-stop action and non-stop vehicular damage, and I was excited to see what this next installment was going to do for us. One thing that's intriguingly different about this one, though, in comparison to other Mad Max films in general, is that it's broken up into 5 chapters, which sometimes works in the film's favor and sometimes doesn't, as it chronicles the life of a young Furiosa, going from a young girl who was in the green place, a place that she was raised in that has abundance of water and food and plants and different things like that, and of course would eventually find herself in the midst of the big villain in Fury Road, Immortan Joe. So I was excited to see what they would do. I think Anya Taylor-Joy does an incredible job here playing the character of Furiosa, a younger iteration of the character, and similar to what they did with Mad Max Fury Road, her character doesn't have a whole lot of dialogue, similar to the character of Max in that film, leaving a lot of the story to be told around her and her kind of be somebody who's in the mix of this crazy story, with the moments that she does speak being fairly impactful. I think Anya Taylor-Joy does an incredible job in the role overall and showcases why she is such a big name in acting today, showcasing some incredible nuance in her facial performances throughout the course of the film to really sell a lot of the emotional beats and things that are happening to the character of Furiosa over the course of the film. Chris Hemsworth, as I mentioned, is in the film as Dementus, the villain, who has got to be one of the most zany characters that he's ever played. I enjoyed Chris Hemsworth in this film, I won't lie. If you've seen the marketing, you know he's got this prosthetic nose on. It was a little distracting in portions of the film. I almost feel like they should have given his character more prosthetics to his face, or just have not given him the prosthetic nose at all, because in a world where you have all these incredibly weird, crazy character designs and characters that look wild and have all sorts of prosthetic differences on their face or crazy costumes, I feel like you needed to have either just gone further with Chris Hemsworth's character's appearance, or just kind of reeled it back altogether, because you know he's got the Mad Max universe franchise kind of like look in terms of his attire and his hair and a lot of the makeup, but the nose just kind of stood out. But outside of that, he's given a really crazy, wild performance here. Chris Hemsworth, of course, nowadays is known for some comedic performances and things, most notably even as the character of Thor, where he can kind of be a little bit goofy and zany, but as a lovable hero type of character, whereas here he's playing this debaucherous warlord character who doesn't care about anybody else except for himself, but he's also able to kind of imbue himself with a little bit of that over-the-top comedy that we've seen in a lot of his more recent performances, which I think in a lot of ways does work. I do think Chris Hemsworth is a lot of fun in here, and without a doubt is kind of the standout here. And as I mentioned before, Anya Taylor-Joy doesn't have a whole lot of dialogue in the film. They kind of keep her relegated to a character who is growing in a lot of silence and has to keep herself silent in a lot of portions of the film. So Chris Hemsworth gets to chew up the scenery with a lot of dialogue, have, oftentimes lending itself to a lot of absurd sequences that were undeniably entertaining thanks to Chris Hemsworth. Outside of the two of them, we're introduced to a bunch of random characters throughout the course of the film, as well as being reintroduced to Immortan Joe and the various individuals that are part of his family and the groups that follow him, which was nice to see some of those characters return once again, a lot of them played by the same actors who played them in Mad Max Fury Road. But the film primarily focuses on Anya Taylor-Joy and Chris Hemsworth, outside of a couple of other characters I won't get into to avoid spoilers. But outside of that, I think George Miller does an incredible job of directing the overall action of this film. Similar to previous films in this franchise, the film is jam-packed with big, over-the-top, bombastic, crazy action that will completely glue you to the screen. I got to see this in an IMAX screening, which was fantastic, and I really enjoyed a lot of the overall aesthetic of this film. However, I would be lying though if I said that I loved the aesthetic of this film as much as the last film, because Mad Max Fury Road is one of those films that was highly praised for its over-the-top visuals, not only when it came to visual effects and digital elements, but mostly for the practical effects and the fact that they were able to capture some incredible stunt work on actual moving vehicles in the real desert on camera in ways that were heightened by digital effects at times, but more often than not caught in camera, which completely made the entire film tangible and exciting to watch, and oftentimes left viewers thinking, how did they capture that on camera? How much choreography went into this? And in the case of Furiosa, while the film does still utilize a lot of great practical effects, practical locations, practical costumes, makeup, and great choreography and stunt work, the film unfortunately utilizes a lot of digital effects in a way that makes a lot of the action seem a lot less realistic and a lot more fake in comparison to the last installment. As a huge fan of Fury Road, it was a bit of a disappointment to watch this film and see there be so many sequences or even just moments where characters are speaking that were utilizing heavy green screen and other technology where they're able to place these characters kind of against a screen and kind of have it all kind of seem a little bit fake. There were so many moments in this film where you can tell they were not in real practical locations. It was probably better on a budget level and for the safety of the actors, but it did kind of take away from the grit that last film had, because visually there were so many moments in this film where you can tell that the vehicles that they're fighting on, the vehicles that are driving around, or the characters that are speaking are all onto some sort of green screen or some sort of screen projection behind them that just didn't give that sense of realistic visuals that the last film did, which was a huge step down in terms of overall visual aesthetic for me. Outside of that, where I struggled with this film honestly was with its narrative. I enjoyed a lot about the performances. I enjoyed a lot about learning more about Furiosa's story and how she came to be the character we see in Mad Max Fury Road, but there was an element of this film that just felt overly long for what it is. It's 2.5 hours, and ultimately I felt like it never really fully warranted its existence. There wasn't really anything about the film that I felt really expanded upon the character of Furiosa or the various other characters we see in Mad Max Fury Road, because ultimately we know where a lot of those characters go. We know where the character of Immortan Joe, the villain of Fury Road, ends up going. We know that he dies. We know that a lot of people around him die. We know where Furiosa goes in the next film. We know that she never makes it to the green place in the next film. So this film does a lot to expand upon these characters, but at the same time ultimately feels like we're kind of spending a lot of time just doing action ultimately for a film that doesn't really expand upon these characters enough. It never really felt like the film had enough stakes, in my personal opinion, for me to care about these characters any deeper than I already did, because it doesn't really feel like it adds a whole lot of new information to these characters. We know where they go. We know what the stakes are for them later on. We know which characters die when. So ultimately, you can't hurt these characters too bad. You can't kill these characters too bad in this film outside of what we kind of already know about these characters. And while I enjoyed a lot about this film visually and action-wise, losing that practical element that was so heavy in the last film and having a story that doesn't necessarily have the same levels of stakes and compelling characters as the last one ultimately left me feeling like this was an enjoyable watch, something I liked, something that was fun to watch, something I would watch again, and by no means is near the bottom of the Mad Max franchise, but by no means also soars at the same heights as the last one, Fury Road. Ultimately, Furiosa is a fantastically action-packed film that utilizes what this franchise is best known for, which is over the top, bombastic action. But by the end of the film, I ultimately felt like there was something left to be desired when it came to the narrative side of things. It also felt overly long for what it was, 2.5 hours of a lot of sequences that felt like they dragged. I liked a lot about the performances. I think Anya Taylor-Joy was great. I think Chris Hemsworth was great. I think a lot of the supporting cast throughout it was great, but there were a lot of elements that just ultimately had me scratching my head. There's a romantic element to this film that's kind of forced in here at a certain point that never really felt like it fully worked for me, and ultimately by the time I got to the end of the film, it just didn't hit the way I was hoping it would. And maybe part of that is my personal expectations and hope. Maybe part of that is just my big fandom for the last film, but I guess it's kind of one of those things where, you know, that classic saying, you know, you're only as good as your last song, you're only as good as your last thing. I don't necessarily fully believe that, but you know, when the last movie was so good, you go into this with expectations that this one will at least be equal or just about as good or somewhere in the same kind of relative space of being good. And while I found this to be a good time, by no means does it hit the highs that the last film did when it comes down to action, spectacle, practical effects, and especially narratively. I just didn't find myself as connected to the story of Furiosa in this movie, and I just don't really ever feel like I knew enough about her that really expanded upon her character that warranted a 2.5 hour movie. A good time, something I would watch again, but that's just my general thoughts. So I look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say about Mad Max Furiosa, or Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga. I'm curious if we'll get more of these films and the Mad Max Saga kind of style, where we will get, you know, more prequel films or solo films on certain characters that maybe we've seen in the Mad Max films. Definitely curious to see where they go moving forward. Again, I just really want to praise Anya Taylor-Joy and Chris Hemsworth. I think they were great in the film, and I think that George Miller, again, knows how to direct some stunning action and visuals and utilizes some great practical effects in here. So that's my thoughts on Furiosa. Looking forward to hearing your guys' thoughts. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.